Anyway, welcome to the PER interest group of optics. We're very happy that you were able to join our session today. For those of you who have not been to one of our sessions before, let me really quick share this with you. All right, everybody seeing that? All right. So we are the Organization for Physics at Two-Year Colleges. We are a virtual one-stop shop for people who are teaching and learning physics at two-year colleges. We have a number of initiatives. And come on now, go forward. Next, there you go. There are initiatives. The QR codes that you see on the slides, I'll take you to our website so that you can see what we have going on. And as I mentioned, we are the PER facilitation group. You are the supporters of our optics grant and our optics project. So I encourage you to join our two-year college Google group and to get involved in any way you can. So I'm going to end that, just because I want to make sure everybody knows who we are and what we're doing. And I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We are going to be talking today about mechanics and E&M assessments, research-based assessments. To do that, we've got Dwayne Dabian. Dwayne got his BS at Grinnell College, his MS at the University of Kansas, and his PhD in physics education research at Arizona State. He has served on the executive board of AAPT, and it was awarded the Distinguished Service Citation and the David Halliday and Robert Resnick Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. And he has also served on the editorial board of The Physics Teacher. He's also given many workshops at national and regional meetings on modeling, discourse management, and assessment, including through the two-year college physics project, the PEPTIC program for modeling, and the new faculty experience for two-year college physics faculty. Dwayne will be talking to us about mechanics assessments. Also with us today is Dave Maloney, who got his BS from University of Louisville, his MS and PhD from Ohio University. He has taught at Wesleyan College in Georgia, Creighton University in Nebraska, and he's currently at Purdue University in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and is a fellow of AAPT. Dave is a long-term friend of two-year college physics faculty and has participated in the two-year college physics project, among other initiatives. And he's co-author of Ranking Task and Tippers books and the co-developer of the CSEM, the Conceptual Survey of Electricity and Magnetism. And Dave will be talking to us about the E&M assessments. So without further ado, I am going to pass this off to Dwayne so that he can begin his presentation. After both of our presenters are done, we will open it up to discussion. All right, go ahead, Dwayne, it's all yours. And
all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to have a formal presentation as in like a PowerPoint because, well, anybody that knows me knows I don't do PowerPoints. And Dave Maloney and I have worked together for a long time, so I will probably invite him to jump in here. I just want to give a few quick things about assessments in general. Good PER-based assessments. They take a very long time to develop. They're very challenging to do, and you're never happy with them once you complete them. Okay, would you say that's fair, David?
You got it.
Okay. Couple things about them. You're really striving for two things: validity and reliability. Both of which can be challenging to get. Reliability, you can get that pretty easy, just make more questions, but that doesn't mean it's really doing what you want. So it doesn't matter what of these instruments it is, it's very important that we keep them, what's the word I want to use, hidden from students. What I mean by that is we don't want them out there in the general public, because then you can see creep of scores, you can get students looking them up. We shouldn't have the name on it when you give it to them. Now, I'm going to talk about mechanics a little bit and offer up two things first. I'm going to share my screen if I can get this working. Let's see. let me just start off here. And I'm sure, hopefully you can see this on my screen. Are you seeing something that looks like a list? Yeah. Okay. I will tell you that if at some point when you're done with today, you have a question about any of these assessments that are on this list, at one point or another, I have gotten permission from every author on this list to distribute and or work with individuals on this. There's many E&M ones on here. There's some, there's mechanics ones on here, such as you'll see like the FCI, FMCE, force and motion conceptual evaluation. Some of them are electricity and magnetism related, but there's different ones. And even like an RTOP, which is a reformed teaching observation protocol, it's not really an assessment of students. It's an assessment of how reformed your teaching is. But any of these that if you at some point want to have access to and don't have access or want more information about, you're more than welcome to reach out to me on that. Okay. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen slightly differently on this. Okay. So anybody that's probably done any of these will recognize this right off the top. This is the second version or the kind of improved version of the FCI, Force Concept Inventory. And anybody that's ever given it knows that when you read it the first time, when you're first time exposed to it, you're going to be like, well, my student should kill this. And then of course they come back and get a 3 out of 30 and you realize that maybe something's different going on than I expected. But some highlights about it. It's very well grounded. It's the distractors, the wrong answers are very much based on research, based on what student misconceptions really are. One of the other advantages of a test like the FCI is it's written in kind of natural language, plain language, which not all assessments are. Why is that important? And I'm going to steal from my co-presenter today, Dave Maloney, because I stole this from him. I still use it. When it's written in plain and natural language, we get at what they really think back here, as opposed to what they heard in physics class, which is just this little piece right up here. And so that's a big difference. Okay, because they may be able to recite to you Newton's third law like it's nothing, but then you ask them this question here, which is really nothing more than Newton's third law, 15, 16, and you're going to be really, really disappointed in how they do typically. So that's the FCI. Another one, by the way, that's from the group at Arizona State University, David Heston, Malcolm Wells, Ibrahim Haloon. Obviously, I did my PhD at ASU, so I'm kind of slightly familiar with these. The mechanics baseline test, and this is a very different test than the FCI. It has some similar type questions. It's got some graphical ones on it, but it also has some math in it. Okay, you'll see numbers and things like N and W that are definitely not in natural language that you would typically see. So it's not a natural language assessment in that regard, but the authors would claim, and I had arguments with the authors about this, that this is as much about a problem solving as it is about mechanics conceptual understanding. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's the author's assertion, and I'm not going to argue with them too much. Okay. Force and motion conceptual evaluation actually came out of the workshop physics project back in the day with Priscilla Laws, David Thornton, Ron Sokoloff. And it's similar in some regards to the FCI, and it's quite different in other regards. There are definitely pieces of the FMCE that are natural language and parts that aren't. It is a broader scope picture than the FCI, which is truly only looking at the force concept and Newton's laws, whereas right in the title of FMCE, there's also the idea of motion, okay, and doing those kind of those pieces. The other pieces, they have some questions like this, where there's, in this case, there's 7 different answers, then ask a series of questions. Which of those 7 answers do you think is most appropriate? So that's a very different strategy and questioning than just the traditional, here's your question, 4 or 5 multiple choice answers to choose from. Okay, you'll also notice in this one that there are, many of those kind of things, also some graphical things that weren't necessarily as much in the FCI, both on acceleration and so on. Okay, but you'll also notice if you've seen the FCI, those questions should look incredibly familiar because again, there's definitely some overlap between the two. Okay. Now, since we're talking mechanics, one of the things we always want to talk about, at least in my mechanic class, we do have energy. Okay. There are a couple energy attempts out there. And I kind of said that intentionally. One is called the energy concept inventory. Okay. Again, primarily from the modeling group at Arizona State University and some of the individuals. It's not purely an energy in mechanics, but it does have a lot of mechanics energy problems in it. Like, you got a ball here, which position is going to go to, and so on. Okay. And also ask some questions that are a little more different about energy, which are kind of interesting, like what are you paying for from your meter there? Okay. And it goes everything from all levels of energy, including like energy involved in nuclear reactions and even chemical reactions. Okay. You've also got the Sing test of energy, which is a little more related directly to physics, or first semester physics, E&M physics, and the things that are occurring there. Okay. A couple others in that alphabet soup that I didn't highlight up here that I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my alphabet soup on. Okay. Are the TUG K, which is right here, which is tests of understanding graphs kinematics, which is actually from Bob Buechner and the North Carolina State group. Okay, which is literally a series of tests, a couple different tests on student understanding of graphs in kinematics. So if you're doing a lot of things using like Vernier or Pasco motion detectors and you're getting the position, velocity, and acceleration graphs, it's a really nice one to use to see if they've gotten what they need from that. So that's another one that sometimes is kind of useful. Okay. Couple things about these as a whole, and I think David would agree with me on this. None of these were really designed to give a student a grade based on. Okay. These are designed to help us being faculty, assess how effective was our teaching. And that's very different than assigning a grade. Because a good one of these doesn't mean your students are getting 100%, because we're really getting at the misconceptions. And the better they're written, the better you can look and say, okay, half my students said this answer B, which is wrong, which tells you a lot about the actual misconception. Okay. So it's really useful to keep that in mind. These are not designed to be used for grades. When you give them dename them, if you look back at my FCI, you saw there, it didn't say FCI on it anywhere, because that's actually the one I give out to students. It just starts there. So that's kind of an overview of a bunch that are available, that are what I will use the term PER based research and validated. Okay, what I mean by that is they've been used a ton. They serve slightly different purposes. When would I use them differently? Well, I'll be honest, I don't use the MBT. Okay, mechanics baseline. I have used FMCE. I have used FCI. I've primarily used those two. If I'm wanting to look at the interplay between the motion and force, I'll use the FMCE. If I want to really hit just Newton's laws, I'm going to use the FCI. It is also not really appropriate to disassemble these and create your own. Okay, what I mean by that is, okay, I really like this question off this one. I like these questions off this one. I'm going to assemble my own. That's perfectly fine, I guess, if you want to use it for your own purposes at your own school, but it really limits what you can say about your student performance compared to others. And so much of this is really important, is to be able to compare your students, your results, to other institutions, whether that's in the original papers or subsequent papers about using it. And I'll stop now and let Dave have his turn. And I'm not sure exactly what he's going to say because we didn't coordinate, but that's all right.
Okay. I'll pick up and say, first of all, that I agree with all of Dwayne's general comments. which in one sense is annoying because I'd rather argue with him. But I'm going to talk about 4 instruments basically. And since I'm, as anyone who knows me, a Luddite, I'm not going to do any screen sharing or anything else like that. The 4 instruments that I'm going to talk about are the CSEM, which is the Conceptual Survey on Electricity and Magnetism, the DIRECT, which is the Determining and Interpreting Electric Circuits Test, the BEMA, which is the Brief Electricity and Magnetism Assessment, and the EMCA, which is the Electricity and Magnetism Concept Assessment. 3 of the 4 are E&M, as their initials indicate. The DIRECT is a different test. It's solely focused on DC circuit understanding. And it was developed by Bob Buechner and, oh crap, Paula Engelhardt, when she was at North Carolina State. And it's a solid instrument about direct current circuits. For the other 3 instruments, they all are, there's overlap in them, but they all have unique features. The Conceptual Survey of Electricity and Magnetism is focused on electrostatics and magnetostatics, and there are no circuits or resistor items in that instrument. It's a 30-item instrument, and as Dwayne said, all of these instruments have as distractors in the various items research-based identification of students' everyday concepts. And that's the important aspect of these instruments. The BEMA is Brief Electricity and Magnetism Assessment. It is also, as the name indicates, electricity and magnetism. It does have some circuit items in it. There are actually several shared items, well, 5 or 6 shared items between the CSEM and the BEMA. That's because when we were developing the CSEM, Bruce Sherwood and Ruth Shabai had some really nice items and we got permission to steal them. And so there's there's 5 items, I believe it is, that are exactly the same on the 2 instruments. Okay. The EMCA, the Electricity and Magnetism Concept Assessment, was developed by a group at college up in New York State. It has electrostatic items, magnetostatic items. There are also some items dealing with resistance and DC circuits. I would characterize the EMCA as a gentler instrument than the CSEM or the BEMA. But otherwise, again, it's very similar in that regard. Those are the 4 instruments that have been out for a long time. There have been a number of follow-up studies on them, a lot of comparison of student performance at different schools, and the instruments are holding up well in terms of the various analyses that have come out over the years. There are other items, other instruments, and the instruments are being developed pretty much constantly. So the Physical Review Physics Education Research online journal has a number of additional items which are showing up, a number of additional instruments. For example, one instrument which is electricity and magnetism, but would not be appropriate at all for an introductory course, there is an instrument called the Q, which is the Colorado Upper Division Electrostatics Test. And it is solely focused on electrostatics, and it is for a junior level major course. So it's significantly stronger than the other instruments. But the 4 basic instruments that I mentioned are all, in my view anyway, fully appropriate for an introductory level course, whether it be calculus-based or algebra-based. And as Dwayne said, they should not be used for grading students. They're really there to help us determine how well we're helping the students, what I always think of as make sense of physics. And if they're going to make sense of it, they have to change their everyday ideas and develop a legitimate understanding conceptually of the physics. And at that point, I think I will quit, because I think the important part of a session like this is the questions.
Okay, thank you, both of you, very much. I'm going to start out with a couple of questions that came out from the, just general comments that were made prior. First of all, if you were a professor who is just starting out using these assessments, what advice could you give to that professor on how best to use those instruments to understand your students and your teaching? And a follow-up to that question, and how would you then use those results to compare to other students or to a conglomerate group of students, in other words, aggregate data. Okay, and I'll open that up to either or both of you.
All right,
Go ahead, Dave.
I'll jump in. My first comment is, if you're new and you give these, have a box of Kleenex ready when you get the results, because you're not going to feel comfortable. It's the kind of thing that we're trying to accomplish, that I believe we're trying to accomplish, in terms of what Dwayne was saying earlier about the students. If they're lectured to, they're going to put the stuff in here. But back here is their common sense, everyday understanding of the physical world. And that has a lot of physics in it, not what we would technically accept as physics, but it is their physics reasoning. And it's, in my view, it's critical to understand that they're going to use that, they're going to reason, they're going to be thinking, but they're going to be using those ideas. And so our task is to help them learn what aspects that they have that are reasonable and appropriate physically, but then to change the others. And that's what these tests do. Since they're phrased in natural language, since they have distractors that are based on research on students' understanding, if they're not actually making sense of it, where they are changing their conceptions, these instruments are going to detect that. And so it's going to be probably, speaking from personal experience, the first couple times you try using these, and you're going to be disappointed. But in my view, the important thing is to learn from them, to understand what they're telling you about where the students are struggling most, why, and give you a handle on improving the development. Dwayne?
I would say, first thing I would say is agree, chin up. Now, I will tell you that the reality is I don't really care about the total score. Okay. So let's say I'm giving the FCI and it's got 30. Great. My student's got a 14. I don't care on average. I'm looking at individual questions and the distribution of answers. If you really want to effectively use these and you want to get at what the ideas are, the overall score is nice, but it doesn't tell you, okay? Because if you look at number, make up a number 5, and 2/3 of the people that missed it answered the same way, then you have a way to look at what misconception they still have or have at the beginning, if you want to frame it that way, and how you can maybe address that in the future differently or in the semester you're currently in. I much prefer to look at it in context of the individual questions, the student distribution. I mean, if they're across the board, okay, which sometimes occurs on the CSEM, but not too often, okay, it means they're random guessing, but you won't typically see that. You'll see very strong movement towards a certain answer. And in that regard, what we want to do is address that somehow through our teaching. So that's my advice, is I'm doing it, focus less on the overall answer, overall score, and focus more on the individual questions and the individual pieces. But that's kind of how I use it. And that's really, I frame my curriculum around it. So I give it the first day, kind of going on to Brittany's question that's also there. I give it the first day of class, and really none of these are designed to be able to be broken up. They're meant to be done as the whole in a single setting. I will also say that I make the time because I find it useful. Okay. And nothing I say is more important than that, probably that 30 to 40 minutes I'm giving up to do that, because now I have a framework of their conceptions at the beginning of class. I can frame some things. There's also times it occasionally happens, especially if depending on who they had for the first semester, if I'm doing second semester, or what high school physics they might have had. There's some areas I can look at and say, okay, I don't have to hit that as hard because they're in pretty good shape. But that's because I'm spending that time looking at that first week, and developing around that. Okay. Are there some math prep that involves, there are math preps out there. They're in that list. I don't know if you looked in that laundry list of ones I had. There's actually a math modeling one in there that'll actually address the math skills. Not necessarily as we need them in physics directly, but it's not unrelated to physics. So that's one, if you're interested, you can consider looking at, and I can share with folks if you're interested. And I will put my email in the chat, which most of you probably have it anyway. But that way, if you do have questions or want to see that one, I can get you a copy of that easier also. By the way, one other thing I'll throw out there, I'm always as Sherry mentioned, I like assessment. I'm one of those weird folks. Okay. That if you get your results and just want to have a discussion and look at okay, what do I see in your student answers versus what you might see in the student answers? Okay, I would gladly, meet with you on some agreed upon time, and either Zoom or otherwise, and have that discussion.
Okay, so Brittany has a follow-up question, and John also has his hand up. Brittany's is in the chat. John, what's your question?
So I know Dwayne talked about doing basically what we used to call a pre-test. I'm wondering if you also do a post-test. And then for Dave, my recollection is, at least where I used the CSEM in the past, it was kind of determined that doing a pre-test wasn't really, didn't really give you a lot of information, because the knowledge base, the framework going into E&M was so minimal that you didn't get a lot of convergence on particular responses.
Let me address what you asked me first. Yes, I do give a post test. It's always a pre-post, because I want to see if I made any changes in particular in those. And by the way, sometimes those changes are just that they went from one wrong answer to a different wrong answer is the most common. But that's also telling me something about my teaching. Second piece, and I'm going to answer the question Dave asked slightly myself. You asked Dave. I for a while I was kind of agreeing that CSEM, but I started giving CSEM as a pretest. A couple of reasons. Because I want to see if the carryover questions, the Newton's third law questions, because there are how they're addressed. Are we getting that carryover from outside of the field to the other? So I have started doing that, and particularly looking for those type of questions to see whether I'm seeing the movement from mechanics to E&M and recognizing it.
Yeah, in terms of using the CSEM as a pretest, it's to me, it's still useful because it can see whether or not there's any change from one year to the next in terms of what ideas they are bringing in, if there are any. But the primary thing to me, I do both pre and post test both semesters, and the main thing I'm looking at is hoping for is that I do see some improvement. I'm needy. I want some indication that I've accomplished something. So I do pre and post. We do administer pre and post in lab. So our first lab each semester is devoted to the pre-tests, and the last lab each semester is devoted to the post-tests. So we don't use class time explicitly for that. And going back to Brittany's earlier question about there is no, that I'm aware of, there is no way to do a 10-minute quiz on these and accomplish what it is we think or want to accomplish. But the instruments do tell me whether or not, when I think I'm making a nice big change this semester, I'm going to approach this in a different way, then having the pre and post test can tell me whether or not I've actually accomplished something or whether I'm having daydreams again.
And on Brittany's last question, if they're giving the, and I have not seen the FCI on the WebAssign, however, if they're using the same distractors and giving the full test, the reliability should be equivalent to what it was on paper. There have been plenty of studies that shown electronic implementations of these versus paper, pencil and paper versions of these really haven't made a difference as long as they're still the full instrument.
All right.
Okay, Brittany, was that, I know you have your hand up. Was that the only question, or did you have another one?
So I think my concern about the WebAssign is that it's easy to the students just copy and paste the question into search and get the answers. So that's why I was wondering about the validity of it being done on WebAssign. Sorry, I have a broken screen, so that's why I'm so blurry. But then the other aspect of the reason why I'm interested in the smaller chunks is because I don't know if it, I mean, yeah, it serves me to evaluate how my students did, to have the big chunk, the big test at the beginning and the big test at the end to see if they've made progress. But then I can't make any changes with my students when I give it to the end. So the idea that crosses my mind is they do the big test at the beginning and then have a broken up smaller pieces. And I know that what you're saying about it won't give the whole wealth, but if I'm covering kinematics, I'm only interested in, did they actually get the idea of kinematics and then compare it to their kinematic scores? Is there a way to then they take the forces one, and did that actually compare to their how they did on their force scales? Did they actually improve based on when they were before the class? So I just didn't know if there are, sorry about this, I didn't know if there was any possibility of making these in smaller chunks so that they're a lot easier to do throughout the semester, so that not only are you getting ideas of how you need to improve, how can you get other people, how can you make those improvements even to impact your students in that semester?
I'm gonna re-emphasize one of the points Dwayne made at the start. One of the major difficulties with this kind of thing is the characteristics of the instruments and the extent to which they're going to give you reliable information and valid information is dependent on the whole instrument. So taking pieces out and using small pieces, you in terms of making comparison or contrast with other groups of students who have taken the whole test, you really can't do that. Because the smaller pieces don't have the same test reliability characteristics as the instrument itself. And so for individual information, I can see where it might be useful, but across comparisons, that would be really problematic in my view.
And let me address it. Let me see if I can help in one different way. I agree with everything David just said. But what you're trying to do is, I'm guessing, more of a formative assessment as they're going. How are they doing? There are other things you can use besides these instruments. Sherry mentioned that David was one of the co-authors and Tom was also co-authors on some of the Tippers books. Okay. There are tasks in there that aren't exactly the same, but they will give you an idea of, from a conceptual standpoint, do students understand this? And there are different formats, different styles. You can ask the same concept, same question from different perspectives, like from a ranking task versus a what if anything is wrong problem, and really kind of hone in that regard. So I tend to use those for my in-semester assessment of my students, as opposed to breaking apart the instruments that are designed to be as one big piece. I hope that helped or answered your question, Brittany. Maybe not the answer you wanted, but
Yeah. Yeah, and I believe those resources are in PR Central, aren't they? I believe.
Not the books, but there are certainly lots of very useful resources in PR Central.
Scott, you have your hand up.
Oh, yeah, thanks. You said you go through them question by question. Is there somewhere on this, I just pulled up this Bizport, somewhere that guides you on how to do that, or are you just doing that by reading the question yourself and saying, this is what the answer is, these are distractors, and so now I know what this one student did, or you have a system of doing that?
I have a spreadsheet that I've set up myself that we have ours scanned in, and then I have a spreadsheet that pulls that data off and breaks it down into, and I can look at the the individual distribution of scores on each individual question. And then I look at that question, what concept is it going for? Look at my distribution, what distractors are they biting on? So I literally do it piece by piece, just like that. Okay. And it may mean some semesters I can't hit them all. I can't make the changes, but I find the ones I think they're most critical are the ones I think I can have the biggest impact and really aim at those for that semester. Does that kind of answer your question, Scott?
Yeah, exactly. I think actually we had that before I started working here, and the person who had something, the system that you talk about, left and took it with them. And so there's been talk to try to bring it back, and well, we'll see. I'm here now.
And I will say again, if this is something as you start wanting to do it, you want to have a discussion offline, with us, I will gladly help you with that. That's something I enjoy doing. I am really one of those nerds that like looking at the data and seeing what it tells me. It's something I enjoy, which is unusual for most people, at least this kind of data.
So I think the fact that we are all disappointed in our results when we see them, our students' results, when I see them, really speaks to the resiliency of those natural conceptions that the students have, that despite our teaching, they still believe them. And there is it basically, there's two ways to look at these tests, at least in my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong. And one is, assessing what our students have learned. And the other is assessing our teaching and our teaching style. There's a lot of stuff in the literature about the pre-post comparison, the Hague factor, so could you speak to the, interpreting these results as how did my students do versus how did I do? Or are they the same?
To me, they're, if not the same, they're very, very closely tied. I'm looking to see if I've helped the students, if I've enabled them to actually make sense of the physics. And the way these instruments set up, the old cliche about teaching to the test, you really can't teach to these tests unless you very explicitly take exactly those items and teach them, which would totally destroy the whole idea of the instruments. But you're working to get at the concepts and the ideas that are there to where the students have not just memorized something, but have actually made sense of it in their own understanding. And to me, if the improvement isn't there, then that means both of us have missed the boat. The students aren't where I'm hoping or have intended them to be, and I didn't. I'm certainly in large part responsible for the fact that we didn't get there. So to me, they're tied together very tightly.
And I want to not lose the question that Michael had put in the chat a little bit ago. He said, any thoughts on using these instruments as supplements to teaching for group work, pair think, share type activities? And I'll let Dave do this one because I know this is one of his favorites.
Don't do it. I would not do that at all. I mean, that's just going to destroy the instrument and its value. I think there are lots of other items that can be used in Think, Pair, Share. And one of the things that I think we should be doing, we should all be doing, is working and developing items ourselves. I'm quite old, and I was actually at the very first meeting of the Physics Education Research Committee for AAPT. One of the people at that meeting was Bob Karplus. And one of the comments he made, which I just resonated so strongly with me, was that he said he thought the development of the establishment of that committee was very important because in his view, every physics teacher, PER should be a cottage industry. We should be all engaged in physics education research. And to me, an integral part of that is that we should be working to develop items, curricular materials, tasks that will help our students make sense of the physics. And it doesn't need to be something where we're, oh God, I'm going to publish this great article or I'm going to produce these spectacular materials. But we can design and develop materials that'll help our students. And to me, that's the whole basis of what we're doing anyway. I'll let Dwayne finish off on that.
I would agree, partly because you also know what would be appropriate and how to ask it based on what you've done and how you tried to address that idea, and your framework and your everything else. Because how you run your class, how you're trying to hit at Newton's third law in your class is going to be unique to your class. And even if you're using some canned materials, you're still going to approach it differently than somebody else. And so a lot of those individual classroom things really need to be what's appropriate for your class. Again, though, as a starting point, I'm not going to undersell those tippers and those ranking tasks. They are phenomenal for that. Okay, they really are. If you don't have a copy or copies of that in your classroom and have an overhead document camera that you can slap them down on at any time as you need to get that. Okay, I may be violating a few Pearson copyright rules, but that's their problem. And I know I'm being recorded, so I just don't care. So
Other questions or comments? There's some very nice comments in the chat, but feel free to speak up as well.
There was a question in the chat from Michael Fileski as well.
oh,
Using
you're talking about using concentration analysis. It's just a different way of looking at the same sets of data. I've played with what he's done. I have not used it personally, but I see no problem with using it. If it's useful to you, great. And how he looks at the data and the results from the FCI and the FM or CSEM. Again, the only wrong way to use data is not use it. And if you're collecting this data, use it, do something with it, make changes. The good news is we have infinite number of changes we can make. The bad news is all too often our changes are going to fail, but that's all right because we already failed. Okay. What I mean by that is I don't mean that harsh, but if you look at the typical scores on these post-test, our students don't get it all. So if we try something and it doesn't improve, they're no worse off than they were to start with. Don't be afraid to fail.
I just want to add sorry, I was going to add one quick thing. Is one of the intents we have with the PR group here is to also promote the idea of sharing the data that we're collecting among the OPTYCs, because I think there are a lot of data available, but that's at four-year universities mostly. And for purposes of comparison, it'd be useful to have a sort of database that includes more OPTYCs than currently are available.
And that's actually one of the main reasons for our future session, the one on April 28th, which is, okay, you've got this FCI data. Maybe you're like many two-year college faculty out there. You've collected this data and just looked at it for your own purposes. Now, how about contributing that to the national database in Data Explorer? In FISPOR, make more two-year college physics data available to the core of research data that's out there, so that the two-year college students are more represented. So that's what our session next time is going to be about. So if you're really interested in these and interested in, using these instruments more and sharing that data, then definitely we would encourage you to come to our next session. Other questions?
I want to address a couple things that are going in the chat here in a hurry, Sherry. So somebody asked where you can get them. I said, well, any on that alphabet list you can email me, but also in FISPORT, and there was a link sent earlier. You can get most of these assessment pieces here also. You do need to log in to reach these and be able to download them, but most of them are actually here, along with a lot of cases, the paper or papers that have been associated with them when they were originally published.
I would also make comment about the section here on best practices, the right way and wrong way to use these instruments. We've addressed a lot of that today, but this information is very, very useful.
And that way you also don't think it was just Dave and I making it up.
I'd like to make a general comment. One of the things in terms of these instruments and in terms of the kind of instruction that I tend to focus on, I've often said I could get 10 physics education researchers together in a room, and we would agree without much difficulty at all that one of the things that needs to be done if we want our students to, what I always say is really learn the physics, which means that they make sense of it, is what is the traditional amount of material that we are supposed to quote cover makes no sense whatsoever. And that it's paying attention to coverage. One of the things that I think about is the fact that most of those bodies about what should be covered in the various courses, most of that was established somewhere around 100 to 150 years ago. And we have learned an awful lot about how humans learn since that time. And everything we've learned, I would argue, strongly indicates that how much was in that initial set is totally ridiculous, cannot be done or even come close to being done. So to me, one of the things you have to be willing to do and not be at all upset about is reduce your coverage. Focus on the parts that you think are important. To me, one of the really important things we're trying to do is we're not just teaching physics, we're trying to help the students learn how to think, how to analyze, how to problem solve. And that's easily, in my mind anyway, as important, if not more important, in some of the physics concepts. So don't be afraid. You know, if you say, well, my results aren't as good as I need them to be, one of the things you may need to do to improve them is dump a fair number of topics that you have been dealing with. Okay, I just saw a comment from reducing coverage for TYC is a problem for potential transfer agreements with four-year schools. I have to tell you that Arnold Ahrens, who was a very interesting individual and who never minced words, once told a two-year college teacher who said, you know, what if I don't cover all these topics, my students are going to have trouble transferring to the University of Washington. The instructor said, what do I tell the UW faculty when they tell me I'm not covering everything? And Arnold's response was, tell them to go to hell.
And Michael, I completely understand your concern about articulation agreements. But let me try to address that two ways. And I agree with Dave's commentary also. But so I've had this conversation with many folks, and I stole this from somebody else. I'm not going to claim that I invented this. All those topics you're dumping, make one long PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, and set them to be on each slide for 2 seconds and just run it on the last day of class. It'll have the exact same effect. That way you covered it.
Yep.
I remember the comment. I don't even remember who it was that made it, that we can cover a topic so well the students can never find it.
Yep.
Right. Well, I mean, at its heart, cover means obscure. So I'm going to cover something up, I'm obscuring it. So it makes perfect sense to me. But I mean, in reality, are there topics oh yeah, sure. If I was in that situation, I was when I was in Kansas, that's what I did. Okay. Had the last class, all those topics I didn't cover, great. Where you hit them today, had the same effect.
Yeah, I had a student ask me yesterday in my general physics algebra-based course, supposedly we're doing modern physics. And the student said, are we going to do anything about quarks? And I told him, I said, yeah, there'll be a PowerPoint the last day for all of quantum.
Yeah.
Again, you know, to address Brittany's question or comment, you know, for our four-year colleges keep track of how the two-year college students perform. If a student has a solid understanding of energy and dynamics, they're going to do fine in thermo and fluids, because that's really what that's all about. So is it really worth the 1 week that you could spend on thermodynamics in your intro physics class? Or is it better to give them that stronger background in dynamics, and lo and behold, they're gonna do better.
Yeah.
Because now they've got a firmer background for the fundamental underlying concepts that go with those topics.
If you don't have the foundation, the topics don't matter.
Yes.
And we've been getting a lot of feedback on this here in Santa Fe, where a lot of our students in physics with calc go to UF, and a lot of the engineering deans and faculty keep telling us our students are doing very well when they transfer. So we've done exactly what you guys have been suggesting. We've cut out a lot of coverage. I've never done thermo in about 20 years, 25 years maybe. And I've got students who now have PhDs in engineering and they haven't suffered one bit. So I keep telling that to my students. I tell them we don't do as much as what maybe some other classes do, but you'll be okay. And nobody has come back and complained. So I think we're fine.
Yeah, one of the things that you have to do, at least in my experience, is we have to sell the students on some of the things we're doing, because there's so much out of what they're used to from all their other courses. But if you can help them understand that they don't need to have seen all these topics one time briefly, they're much better off if they actually learn how to reason through and learn how to learn something, because then they can handle anything that they encounter. There's a really good video on Versatium. I think I always screw up the thing, but Veritasium, I guess it is. The guy down in Australia, he has an excellent video on thinking fast and slow. And I actually use that at the start of all my courses to show the students that they need what the difference between just having something in memory and thrown out right away versus actually thinking something through and really understanding it.
And before we finish our last few questions and we run out of time, I would like to remind everyone to be sure to fill out the survey before we leave today. Chris has provided the link to that survey in the chat. So please let us know how we did, what you got out of this, and any suggestions for improvement. Are there any further questions, comments, or anything else?
I'll just jump in and just back up what everyone said, but also give Brittany and others who are having the same concerns, hopefully a little bit of comfort, because I also felt that way. And over time, I found I would just be removing just a little bit more, like, well, I'll just drop this one little section so that I can spend more time on something more fundamental. And now that I look back, I dropped an awful lot of stuff, and my students have come back and have told me that they're doing better than students after they've transferred, better than the students who started at the big state school. So I mean, on paper, yes, we cover all of those topics. In reality, I tell them exactly what Dwayne said, is that you've seen all these topics. Here you go, like quick. So don't say you've never seen these. And it has never come back to bite me. So I'm hoping that gives a little bit of reassurance.
And I will say, as somebody who's been teaching into community college since 1993, which is a lot shorter than like Tom was and so on, but I mean, full-time in a community college since 1993, I have yet to have somebody question what I'm covering based on how my students perform when they transfer.
Michael, you have a question?
Well, no, just a comment. I put it in the chat. We do have that. One of the big colleges in our state would not accept our Calculus 1 class because if you went on their website, they claimed we didn't cover the chapter in enough detail, but they accepted Calc 2 and 3. So, I just want to make sure that Brittany got that I understand your issue, and I try to do the best I can to not only do the right thing for my students, but also to satisfy particular overlords that feel that they have a better understanding of everything that goes on just because they saw one exam and they felt that it was insufficiently deep enough on one particular topic. And it was funny having students taking Calculus 3 in my class, then taking Calculus 1 at other institutions at the same time to get credit for the course.
Well, the good news here in Arizona is that they've taken all the physics and engineering, don't even Calc 1 is a prereq for everything now. It's not even a part of the curriculum. So they'd be great. They don't have to worry about it because then the first course that counts towards their major is Calc 2. So they're all good.
All right, well, we are now at 4 o'clock. So I would ask that we thank our presenters. I really appreciate everyone coming today. It was a wonderful conversation. And Jane has put some information regarding the force concept inventory in the chat for us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close our session. Thank you so much, Dwayne and Dave, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.